As you know, in the last few years, there's been really a lot of progress in many subfields of AI. We've been able to develop computer vision systems that are pretty good at detecting objects in images, understand what's going on in videos, speech recognition systems that work pretty well. In natural language processing, we've been able to translate between different languages, being able to build computer systems that can be the very best human players at very complicated games like Go, and many more such really exciting advances that are happening in AI these days. And so it's pretty clear to me that these technologies are going to have a revolutionary impact on pretty much every aspect of the economy and our society. And what I'm interested in is thinking about how we can use these technologies to actually end up benefiting as many people as possible and really promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world. And so the reality here is that 60% of the world population still lives in developing countries. And the situation, the reality here is that a lot of progress is not happening. A lot of investments are not being made by both private companies and governments because we don't understand what's going on the ground. We don't have good data that we can use to figure out what kind of investments we should make. There's too much uncertainty. We don't know what kind of investments are working and which ones are not. We cannot track accountability. We cannot figure out on the ground how the situation is improving if these investments are being made. And this is perhaps best summarized by this quote from Kofi Annan. He said, data gaps undermine our ability to target resources, develop policies, attract accountability. Without good data, we're flying blind. If you can't see it, you can't solve it. And so, this is just to be a little bit more quantitative. If you think about the way we get nationally representative economic data, this is done typically through surveys. You have to send people on the ground, and that can be pretty expensive. And as a result, there are many parts of the world where these surveys are not done very frequently. This is a map showing basically the frequencies of surveys, nationally representative economic surveys across the world. Each country is color-coded basically by how long it takes between two consecutive surveys. And you can see that there are many parts of the developing world where this kind of economic data is lacking, is provided maybe every decade or something like that, which is just not enough to make good economic decisions. And similarly, like if you think about population, if you think about agricultural censuses, like a key input to a lot of big policy problems and sustainability problems, the kind of data that we have access to is just too sparse and not good enough to make good decisions. And so we've been thinking a lot about how can we take advantage of these advances that we've seen in AI and machine learning to essentially provide this kind of fine-grained information about what's going on the ground in a way that is more scalable than actually sending people and knocking on doors. And the idea is that there is a lot of new ways of collecting data about what's going on around the world, through satellites, through phones, through crowdsourcing that are potentially much more scalable. And perhaps we can combine these new information streams with advances in machine learning to come up with more scalable and better ways to track economic activity, track agricultural productivity, access to infrastructure, all kinds of key inputs that we will need to make both investments and policy decisions. And in particular, I've been focusing a lot on satellites. There's been really a lot of progress in satellite technology over the last 15, 20 years, both because of private investments and public investments. Here you can see what a village in Uganda would look like maybe 15 years ago using the publicly available Landsat sensor. The image is very pixelated. You can't really see much about what's going on the ground. But the good news is that the satellite technology has gotten much better. This is the same area as you view it from space today, where basically the spatial resolution is much better due to improvements in remote sensing. And with these kind of images, you can start seeing a lot more about what's going on the ground. You can start seeing houses, roads, fields. And you can even get access to higher resolution images. These are maybe updated less frequently, but they might be sub-meter resolution, where you can start seeing like things like shipping containers in a shipping yard. You can start seeing cars, motorcycles, how the environment is changing, various aspects of economic activity that you can potentially understand if you were able to process these images automatically, figuring out what's going on the ground. And that's kind of like the good thing. I mean, these days you can even get access to high resolution videos from space. So this is something that is available commercially today. But again, kind of like the challenge is there is a lot of this data. These images are updated very frequently. And so the question is, can we process this data in a way that is automatic so that we can scale this up to very large geographies? If we could do that, that would create a revolutionary way to track economic activity and track what's going on the ground. This is a plot that we produce, kind of like looking at how frequently would a typical, let's say, household in the United States of America show up in one of the surveys that are done in the United States. And that's roughly every 10 years. That's roughly the frequency that based on the kind of surveys that are being made in the US, that's roughly how frequently that household would show up in these surveys. In Africa, that's about once every 1,000 years. And that's kind of like already reflecting a several orders of magnitude gap there. But I think what's exciting is that, a typical household, let's say even in places like Africa or other developing countries in India or Central America, would show up in one of these high resolution satellite images or medium resolution satellite images, maybe once a week or once a month. And so this is really creating another huge opportunity for coming up with much more fine-grained and much more granular ways of tracking what's going on the ground, if we had a way to sort of like process these images in an automatic way and figure out what's going on the ground in a accurate and cheap way. So that's kind of like the high level idea. Perhaps we can provide this data that we need to make better investments, especially in places where this data is lacking the most, using AI to really figure out what's going on in these emerging markets. And so this is kind of like the high level view of what we've been trying to do, and we've done with a team of researchers at Stanford. We've basically built a system that takes as input these satellite images, which contain a lot of information to the human eye. A person can see buildings, houses, roads, cars, things like that. We've built a system to do that basically automatically. We use the deep neural network, a state-of-the-art machine learning system, to basically take these images, process them, identify all these kind of visual features that are relevant to economic activity on the ground, and let's say use it to understand the kind of assets people own, the kind of, we can even estimate consumption, how many dollars per day people have access to. We can estimate, figure out what kind of infrastructure people have access to. We can understand agricultural productivity, tracking fields and estimating their yields. There's all kinds of economic indicators. We can understand where people live. All kinds of economic indicators, all kinds of inputs that are key to a lot of policy decisions can actually be estimated in a fairly accurate way and in a much more scalable way just from space, right? Because these images are cheap, they're available everywhere, they're updated frequently. You just feed them through a machine learning system, and then we can use them to get this much more granular understanding of the situation on the ground. And so this is sort of like the high level view of how this works. You would have a location that you care about, you would acquire a satellite image for that location, you would extract all kinds of visual features that are relevant to economic activity, what kind of buildings there are, is there access to water, are there swimming pools there, how many cars you see. And then we basically have a predictive model that will use these features to predict the kind of socioeconomic outcomes we care about on the ground. And once you have this model, once you've trained a model on some existing survey data or economic data, then you can take new locations where you didn't know what was going on the ground. You can acquire the images, you can feed them through the model, and you come up with predictions essentially everywhere at a very high spatial resolution, unlike surveys that are typically very, very sparse. And it turns out that these models are actually very accurate. If you care about some kind of key indicators of economic well-being, like asset wealth, some kind of index of asset owner that basically captures assets, the asset ownership or even consumption, kind of like capturing how many dollars per day people have access to spend. It turns out that the predictions that we get from space are pretty accurate. Like if you compare the predictions with the ground truth as measured by surveys, the R square, which is just a metric that we use to capture how accurate the predictions are, is close to 0.7, which means that we can explain about 70% of the variation that exists on the ground just by using satellite images. And this is a study that we had last year, pretty large scale study looking at essentially all the survey data that was available across the African continent. And so we are excited again, because even though these measurements are not perfect, they are cheap. We can produce them using images, which are available everywhere, updated frequently, and relatively inexpensive. And so this is one of the things we did. Then we took this model and then we just applied everywhere in the African continent. We've done it also in India, in other parts of Southeast Asia. And you can come up with this kind of like economic indicators map that will tell you how different regions are doing economically compared to each others. And this is what the economic indicators would look like here. The colors represent different levels of asset wealth, and you can zoom in all the way. If you care about a particular country, let's say like Kenya, you can see how wealth is distributed spatially across different districts. And what's exciting is that you can zoom in all the way to individual villages, and you can understand the kind of like variation that exists on the ground, which could be useful if you're thinking about it, making economic investments, or if you're a government trying to understand the situation on the ground, or you're an NGO trying to figure out whether the kind of interventions that you're using are working or not. All kinds of analysis that would typically require survey data, or they are not done because they require survey data that is not available at all, are now made possible by these kind of indicators that we can produce inexpensively from space. You can also track changes over time because the images are updated. You can just feed them through the system, and you can keep track of how the situation is changing on the ground. Here's what it looks like in West Africa. You can kind of see the stark difference between Ivory Coast and Ghana. This is basically the estimated change in economic well-being in these two countries. I think in the decade from 2003 to 2018, and you can see that while one country experienced like very large growth, it's like very red in this map. The other one actually didn't grow almost at all, probably due to the civil conflicts that they had across that time interval. This is, let me skip this, but this has been really, really exciting. We got a lot of good press about this. It was mentioned in the White House report on the future of AI. Lots of excitement from people like Bill Gates was tweeting about it. We were excited to be selected by Scientific American as one of the 10 world-changing ideas of that year when we published this paper. So we're very excited about all the kind of things that will be enabled by these technologies going forward, including applications both in the private sector and in the public sector. So far I've talked mostly about economic well-being, but we've also developed similar techniques to understand agricultural systems, which are key if we're thinking about feeding a growing world population and understanding how to deal with climate change. Food insecurity is going to be a huge problem, and we've developed similar systems that can essentially understand agricultural productivity from space. It's kind of like a similar pipeline. We acquire images of the Earth from space, and we use them to understand how different crops are doing on the ground. This is a demo of the system, or essentially tracking and predicting. This is in the Midwest, kind of like the breadbasket of the United States. We're trying to understand the soybean productivity from space. The different squares that you see on the right are different counties in the US, and the system is basically predicting how much soybean will be produced in that county in that before the harvest in that year. And what's exciting is that this system is as accurate, if not more accurate, than what the Department of Agriculture can do. But we can do it from space. Well, they actually have to, call out farmers, collect samples on the ground, which are much more labor-intensive and expensive process that only exists in a few select countries, while our technology only requires satellite images, remote sensing data, which means that we can apply it all over the world. In fact, we did apply it to various countries in Africa. Here you can see what it would look like when we apply to Kenya, trying to understand maize yields there. And again, basically what's going on is that we can understand how different regions, how maize fields perform, and the difference in performance of maize fields across different regions in Kenya. And what's exciting is that we have very high resolution. Basically, we can go down all the level to individual smallholder farmers' plots, and we can really understand how they're performing. We can predict how many tons per hectare they're gonna have in a particular year, and we can start seeing a lot of the variation that exists on the ground. Like, why is this field performing much better than that other field? How are yields changing over time as an effect of climate change? So all kinds of interesting analysis that are made possible through this kind of technology that we can scale over extremely large geographies and over time fairly inexpensively. And it's not just that. We've been able to track access to infrastructure. Do people have access to electricity? How reliable is it? When did they get access to electricity? Again, all from space. And many more. We can understand the population density. We've been able to track refugee camps, and perform environmental monitoring, understand crop diseases, all kinds of things that we can do, combining machine learning with satellite images and remote sensing data. We've also been using other kinds of information streams, not just images of the Earth from space, but also on the ground. Things like Google Street View, if you've used it before, cars driving around and collecting images of what's around them. There's a lot of this data available, including in developing countries, and hundreds of millions of these images, and it's growing exponentially fast. And the idea is that, again, these images contain a lot of information about what's going on on the ground. And we've developed systems. This is in India, but essentially similar systems that take all these images, process them using modern computer vision, understand the kind of objects that you see, the cars, the bikes, the stands, the road quality, and we use all these features to understand economic well-being, population density, even measures of population health, like measures of malnutrition. It turns out you can estimate them reasonably well using this kind of cheap and inexpensive and widely available data sources. And yeah, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll conclude. This is kind of like my high-level view. I think our society is facing some pretty formidable challenges, including in the sustainability space. These are big problems, and one of the reasons these problems are so hard is that we don't understand them very well. And I think that the first thing we can do as computer scientists, as machine learning experts, is try to fill this data gap and close this data divide that we see between developing countries and developed countries. And I think AI can play a huge role here. We can take all these new unstructured but widely available data streams, and we can come up with completely new ways of sensing our planet and tracking the health of our planet almost in real time. And I think this kind of data will be very, very helpful in terms of developing better policies, tracking accountability, really understanding much better what's going on around the world in a much more granular and scalable way. And so I think that's it for my presentation. And if there is time, I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Stefano, for being Swiss accurate on the timing. And thank you also for a fascinating presentation and a very cool work that you've presented. We don't have questions yet in the chat, but I have a question for you related maybe to interpretability. Have you tried to look at what features of images are predictive of economic indicators? I mean, maybe more trees on an image means higher revenues. And even going further than that, have you tried to look at causal relationships?
Both great questions, yeah. So on the interpretability, we've developed both sort of like end-to-end systems where we just train a neural network to predict outcomes of interest. And then we've tried to kind of like probe the network and use a bunch of the existing techniques to understand activation maps and understand the kind of features the neural network is looking for. And we had some success with that. And it seems like it's looking for reasonable features like the one I showed. I didn't have time to go into the kind of like explaining exactly the activation maps, but yeah, it looks like it's looking for cars, it's looking for swimming pools. I think that was my favorite filter that the network learned, and things like that. But then I know this came up quite a bit when we talk with decision makers and end users. Yeah, they want to understand why the model is making these predictions, and this kind of analysis was not convincing enough. So we've also developed more interpretable models where we essentially first perform object detection. And we have like a few hundred kind of like common objects that we can really reliable detect in satellite images, again, like cars and buildings and boats and all kinds of stuff. And so we have a two-stage pipeline where we first do object detection, and then we use object counts to then make predictions on the kind of indicators that we want to estimate. And that's a much more interpretable model, because at that point, then you know exactly. Then we can use a simple linear model based on the object counts, and that works slightly worse, but it's still pretty accurate, and it's a lot more interpretable because then it's just like basically linear regression based on object counts. In terms of causality, that's something we haven't looked at directly, but I know some colleagues at Stanford are actually trying to use this data to do causal inferences, and the way they do it is that they are looking at regions across borders between two countries, and then they are kind of like looking at the variation that exists between these two countries, let's say, and then it's kind of like a discontinuity analysis where they're kind of like trying to understand where the variation that we're able to estimate from space might be explained by different policies being implemented by the two countries. But that's more about kind of like using the data to do causal inferences as opposed to kind of like building a causal model that can explain things directly. And I know there is a recent study from UC Berkeley where they also used satellite images to understand, to basically estimate treatment effects of cash transfers, so that they had like a randomized control study, I think in Kenya, where they were doing basically a cash transfer program. And then they were able to actually see the effect of these cash transfers that they were doing just by looking at the high resolution satellite images of these villages where they were performing this experiment. So again, this is promising because it seems to suggest that you could potentially use these techniques to perform this kind of analysis, which is often done whenever people are trying out new interventions on the ground.
I see. Thank you very much. And one last question. So if I understood correctly, you're training your model on regions where you have data, say in European or Western countries, and then you're predicting on regions where you don't have survey data, such as in Africa. How are you accounting for the fact that maybe images of European grounds are very different than the one in Africa?
Oh yeah, so we were not training in West, let's say Europe, and then testing in Africa. We're still training, let's say, on data from Africa, and then predicting in either the same country, in locations where you don't have survey data, or in different African countries. So, and that works pretty well to the extent that you train. If you train a model even in East Africa and you test it in West Africa, it's not going to work. But as long as there is enough, you have some relatively similar countries, then the model transfers pretty well. And you can see in the papers, we did all kinds of experiments, kind of like leave one country out, cross-validation, where we're trying to train on a few countries and make predictions on a country, pretending we don't have data there, and then checking how well the model does. And it does reasonably well.